Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd be grateful if you could please welcome Lord Lilley of Offa.
Thank you, Barry, for that kind introduction. Just beforehand, you asked me why I had chosen the title Offa, Lord Lilley of Offa. Well, I lived in the village of Offley, in the ward of Offa. Actually, it was called the ward of Lilley, Offa and Who, because there was a village called Lilley nearby. Someone said I should take the title Lord Lilley of Lilley. That seemed a bit presumptuous. Others said just Lilley who? However, I took Offa because King Offa, who had had a palace there and had been the top king of England in the 900s or thereabouts, was king of, claimed to be king of all of Britain. At the time, Charlemagne was busy creating the Proto-European Union, uniting Europe in the Charlemagne Empire, why the European Union goes its main building, the Charlemagne building. And Emperor Charlemagne wanted to incorporate Britain in his empire, as continentals do, and therefore suggested to King Offa that King Offa should marry one of his sons to one of Charlemagne's daughters. Offa could see where this was leading and said, well, only if you marry one of your sons to one of my daughters. And Charlemagne was so incensed by the impertinence of this offshore islander doing this that he declared a trade embargo against Britain and closed all continental ports to British commerce. This unfortunately caused more harm to Europe than it did to the UK. The church mediated, and a couple of years later the first free trade agreement between Britain and Europe was signed. So it seemed a good title to take. Now, to get down to the business of the day, there are three subjects which in this country you cannot discuss from a sceptical perspective on the BBC or other mainstream media and in polite society. They're immigration, climate change, and the European Union. I would like to address all three, but I don't have time, so I'll start with immigration. The main reason the majority of people voted for Brexit, as they declared in the exit polls as they came out of the voting booths on the day of the referendum, was to take back control of our own laws. They said, we want to make our own laws. That was over 50% of all voters said that. The second most important issue, by far from the most, was immigration. They wanted to control our borders, both for immigration and for trade. So it's an important issue, and it was important not just to people who voted for Brexit, but people who voted against. Basically, lots and lots of them want us to have proper immigration control in this subject, in this country. But we don't. And we don't because there's been an elite consensus that we should not even discuss the issue rationally. The old maxim that facts speak for themselves is simply bunkum. They don't speak for themselves, they need people to highlight those facts. And you haven't been allowed to highlight those facts until, even now, on the mainstream media. When Tony Blair decided to open our borders, initially he relaxed immigration controls after the election in 1997 worldwide, but in 2004 he abolished all immigration controls for the new member states, even though he didn't have to. He made a speech justifying that to the CBI, and he said it would opening us up to immigration would do three things. It would fill skill shortages in specific professions. It would assuage an overall labour shortage in the UK economy, and it would boost our economic growth. Now, I did natural sciences at university, and we took this sort of old-fashioned scientific view that if you expressed a theory, you had then to check it against the facts. The greatest physicist of the second half of the last century was Richard Feynman, who said, the scientific method is very simple. You enunciate a theory, you make predictions on base of that theory, you compare them with the facts. If the facts disagree with the predictions, the theory is wrong. No matter how elegant, how prestigious the author of that theory, it is wrong. So the theory is that immigration would fill labour shortages in specific areas, assuage an overall shortage of labour, and boost our economic growth. We've now tried that experiment for over 20 years, and it hasn't worked. Specific skill shortages have got worse in precisely the areas where they were greatest at the time it started. The overall labour shortage, which Tony Blair stood up and said, we have 600,000 empty jobs in the country. Since then, we've let millions of people into this country. We now have over 1 million empty jobs. So it hasn't assuaged the overall labour shortage. And it was supposed to boost our economic growth. And yet after 2 or 3 decades of the highest level of immigration we've ever had in our history, we've had the lowest level of growth in productivity in this country. You'd have thought, if a policy hadn't worked in practice, people would question the theories behind it. But there's been a sort of conspiracy between employers who want to import cheap labour from abroad, and virtue-seeking intellectuals who've condemned any criticism of open borders and mass immigration as racism, to stop discussion on this subject. So let's actually consider what economics tells us about these issues. Specific shortages. Way back, in fact shortly before Tony Blair made his speech to the CBI, the ILO, the International Labour Office, a branch of the United Nations, not notoriously a racist body, said that, published a document which said that trying to remove domestic skill shortages by increasing immigration would only intensify the shortages. Its actual words were, what may begin as a temporary shortage of trained native workers can be made more permanent by attempting a quick fix from migrant labour, importing migrants into a sector whose employers are complaining of insufficient trained natives will exacerbate rather than alleviate its native shortage. Why is that? Because if you allow the importation of cheap labour, it keeps the pay in that sector below the market clearing level, below the level it would naturally reach in the absence of an inflow from abroad. So since it's below the level of wages in comparable professions, people leave. Eventually, even the immigrants who come in and fill those jobs think, oh, it's better having a job paying X pounds per week, twice as much as I used to get in my native country. But if there's the opportunity of getting X plus 50%, they'll move to another profession, so they move out of the profession. So there's a continuous flow in and out of areas where we have a shortage, once you try and fix that shortage by flows from abroad. By contrast, when the government resists the siren calls to issue more visas, shortages evaporate. Remember the great shortage of HGV, heavy goods vehicle drivers in late 2021? I can remember driving for 2 hours around South London trying to find petrol because there was a shortage of drivers. They couldn't even deliver petrol to most of the garages. Why was that? Well, heavy goods vehicle drivers had been held down for years as Eastern European drivers came in and took more and more of the business and displaced British drivers. Then during the pandemic, heavy goods vehicle drivers, a lot of them had gone home because of course the economy was largely shut down, so they'd gone back to Eastern Europe. British drivers had left the HGV business and gone into delivering for Deliveroo and Amazon because people were shopping online, and it's a relatively easier job, didn't have to drive away from home. I only discovered this when I had my 6-monthly meeting with my local health authority. They said they were having a shortage of nurses, they were sending out recruiters to Portugal and Greece. I said, why are you doing that? Why don't you recruit from Hertfordshire University? It has a nursing college and trains nurses. They said, we do. They are wonderful. The nurses coming out of Hertfordshire University are brilliant. We recruit everyone we can. They're well trained, well motivated, they speak English and they can get to the job straight away. But there aren't enough of them. So I went to see the principal of the Vice-Chancellor of the university. Said, you've got a real opportunity here. You could expand your nursing department. There's tremendous demand for your nurses. He said, I know, but we're not allowed to. There's a ration on the number of places. We have to turn away 3 people for every place in the university. So I went to see the Secretary of State for Health. And he said, yeah, he just discovered that effectively, to his credit, and was arguing with the Chancellor to change things and remove that overall cap, and they did, and they instead made nurses who previously had bursaries, which came out of the health service budget, and that's why the health service wanted to limit the number, because in the short term, they increased the number that used up money which could otherwise be used for the winter health crisis or whatever. So they changed that, but still there's a de facto limit. Now they're gradually easing it. Slowly the message is getting through that there are lots of British people who want to be nurses and doctors, and we have to start training them now. It should have started 20 years ago, but only if we start training them now we'll be able to alleviate that. So that's specific shortages. But what about the overall shortage? When people say the trouble with immigration is it will take British jobs, orthodox economists will say that is nonsense. That's the lump of labour fallacy in economic jargon. That's the assumption there's a fixed number of jobs. If immigrants take some of them, there won't be enough to go around to the natives. That is nonsense. If there are more workers, there's an infinite amount of work that needs to be done, and the demand that those workers create will create demand for extra jobs. And the converse is equally true. If we say we need to import people from abroad to assuage a shortage, that's nonsense, because those people from abroad are not just producers, not just workers, they're also consumers. They consume as much as they produce. And therefore they simply add to demand by as much as they assuage demand. And that's why, despite importing several million extra workers over the last couple of decades, the overall shortage of workers has actually increased, and that reflects the amount of money the government pumps into the economy versus total size of the economy. So you cannot assuage an overall shortage by importing people unless they're slaves and don't consume what they produce. Which I don't think the advocates of migration actually explicitly want to go back to slavery. I was on the select committee that shadowed the department for leaving the European Union, DEXEU. And we decided that we should go and visit different parts of the country. And by coincidence, the first place we decided to go to visit was the northeast. And so the committee I was the only Leave voting MP on the committee who went up to Sunderland, which, if you remember, was the first place who reported voting on the referendum night that they had surprised everybody by voting to leave. And we went up there and we met the local county council, district council, CBI, institute directors, Chamber of Commerce, et hoc genus omni. And they all said, all were terribly apologetic. They assumed the committee was in favour of Remain and apologised that despite their best efforts, they hadn't been able to deliver the vote, as they put it. And people hadn't supported Remain. And I said, well, why are you worried? What's wrong? You know, we left. So why did you want to stay? And they said, oh, so that we could recruit skilled labour from abroad, even up in the northeast, which was not notoriously short of labour. The one local employer who wasn't there was Nissan, the biggest employer in the area. And I had visited Nissan when I became Secretary of State for Trade and Industry some years earlier. And they just started up, and I said to them, do you have any difficulty recruiting trained automobile workers? They were Japanese, very polite, didn't point out what a stupid question this was. There were obviously no trained automobile workers up in the northeast of England for them to recruit. They said, well, we can't actually recruit trained automobile workers, but we recruit workers and we train them. And they're terribly eager to be trained. And they're very good when they are trained. and we have to do a bit of remedial reading and even more arithmetic, but once we've done that, they're fantastic. And that Nissan plant is now the most efficient Nissan plant in the whole world Nissan network. So I reminded the locals of this and said, just imagine Nissan had taken the same view as all of you, that we should fill skill shortages, not by training people ourselves, but by bringing them in from outside. There would now be 9,000 Polish workers in that plant, and 9,000 Brits would be flipping hamburgers or on the dole. And amazingly, they all wanted to change the subject. Now, the final reason people give, which is related to this, that mass immigration is supposedly good for us, is that it will boost our economy. Well, of course, it makes the economy bigger if you've got more workers, but the only test of an economy is, does it make you raise your living standards? Does it increase your consumption, your living standards per head? And that can only happen if you increase your output per head. Well, if it had done that, we'd know. Why hasn't it done that? Because there are only two things which boost your productivity. One is more investment per head, and the other is more training and skills per head. And the one thing that undermines the incentive to invest in productivity-raising capital is the availability of cheap labour. And the one thing that undermines people's own willingness to train and acquire higher skills, or employers' willingness to train them and upskill them, is the ability to employ cheap trained labour from abroad. So for 20 years we've allowed the two biggest incentives or disincentives to growth-creating investment in capital and training. And we wonder why growth in this country has ground almost to a halt. Now, I rest my case. I think we need to make substantial reductions in the level of immigration in this country. In the long term, there's no particular reason why we should have any net migration. Of course, there'll be flows in and out. Nissan, for example, brought in Nissan specialists to set up the plant and transfer their skills, which were company specific, to the people they were training up in this country. All, not just skills of people on the production line, but the accountants, the sales, and so on. And they stayed there for 5 years and then went back home again. Wonderful, having transferred skills. So there'll always be some flows back and forth. But the idea that a country can only grow by constantly taking a net inflow is absurd and has no rational justification. So I hope that we will react to these extraordinarily high figures that have just come out. They've revised last year's figures up by about 140,000. The net immigration has risen from 606,000 to 745,000 or something. That increase is more than what we considered far too high when we were first elected, the Conservatives were first elected in 2010. So we've got to bring it down. We can bring it down. If we do bring it down, we'll force businesses to become more efficient, people to become more skilled, there to be more investment, and we'll become a richer country. But above all, we will stop intensifying the housing crisis. One of the worst crises this country faces is the shortage of housing. I wrote a pamphlet back at the beginning of this century, which I started writing about housing, because in my area in Hertfordshire, every year we were forced to raise the official targets of the number of new houses we had to build. I wondered why this was, because the actually the birth rate in Hertfordshire was below the death rate. So why do we need more houses? And everybody said, oh, well, it's because, of course, people are moving from the rest of the United Kingdom down to the southeast. I looked at the figures. Actually, there was a net outflow from London and the southeast to the rest of the country because housing was so expensive down here. And it was in the process of writing that I realised that it was the net inflow from abroad which was one of the major factors in our housing crisis. Something like 80% of the new homes we build every year are matched by new households coming into the country or being formed when they're in the country. Because immigrants there may be differences between different categories of
immigrants and us. But by and large, the problem is not that immigrants are different from us, but they're exactly the same as us. They live in houses. We've got to build houses for them. They get ill. We have to have hospitals for them. Their children want to go to school, and rightly so, we have to build schools for them. The idea that you can't sort of take into account the counterpart of the needs from the inflow is absurd. We have to break the taboo on discussing these issues rationally, stop pretending it's a matter of racism or virtue. It's about common sense and improving the lot and well-being of the British people of all colours who are already here. Thank you.